considering the crisis from which we had emerged, the factions by which we had been divided, and the plots which had been laid and were still contriving, imprisonment became indispensable. It was, in fact, a benefit, for it superseded the scaffold. But I was desirous of sanctioning it by legal enactments and of placing it beyond the reach of caprice, of arbitrary power, of hatred, and of vengeance. Nobody, according to my law, could be imprisoned and detained as a prisoner of state without the decision of my Privy Council, which consisted of 16 persons, the first, the most independent, and most distinguished characters of the state. What unworthy feeling would have dared to expose itself to the detection of such a tribunal? Had I not voluntarily deprived myself of the power of consigning individuals of prison? None could be detained beyond a year without a fresh decision of the Privy Council, and 4 votes out of 16 were sufficient to effect his release. 2 councillors of state were bound to attend to the statements of the prisoners, and became from that moment their zealous advocates with the Privy Council. These prisoners were also under the protection of the Committee of Individual Liberty appointed by the Senate, which was the object of public derision merely because it made no parade of its labors and their results. Its services, however, were great, for it would argue a defective knowledge of mankind to suppose that senators, who had nothing to expect from ministers, and who were their equals in rank, could not make use of their prerogative to oppose and attack them. Whenever the importance of the case called for their interferences, it must also be considered that I had assigned the superintendents of the prisoners, of the police, of the prisons, to the tribunals, which from that instant paralyzed the exercise of every kind of arbitrary authority belonging to the other branches of administration and their numerous subordinate agents. After such precautions, I do not hesitate to maintain that civil liberty was effectually secured by that law in France, as it could possibly be. The public misconceived, or pretended to misconceive, that truth, for it is necessary for us Frenchmen to murmur at everything and on every occasion. The fact is that at the time of my downfall, the state prisons scarcely contained 250 individuals, and I found 9,000 in them. When I became consul, it will appear from the list of those who were imprisoned, and upon an examination into the causes and motives of their confinement, and almost every one of them deserved death, and would have been sentenced to it by regular process of law, and it consequently follows that their imprisonment was on my part a benefit conferred on them. Why is there nothing published against me on this subject at present? Where are the serious grievances to be found with which I am reproached? There are none in reality. If some of the prisoners afterwards made a merit of their sufferings with the king on account of their exertions in his favor, did they not by that proceeding pronounce their own sentence and attest my justice? For what may seem a virtuous action in the king's eye was incontestably a crime under me, and it was only because I was repugnant to the shedding of blood on account of political crimes, and because such trials would have been tended to the continuance of commotion and perplexity in the heart of the country, that I commuted the punishment for simple detention. I repeat it, the French were, at my era, the freest people of all Europe, without even excepting the English. For in England, if any extreme danger causes the suspension of the habeas corpus act, every individual may be sent to prison at the mere will of ministers who are not called upon to justify their motives or give an explanation of their conduct. My law was very differently restricted, he concluded with saying. And then at last, if in spite of my good intention, and notwithstanding my utmost care, that you have just said, and no doubt many other things were well founded, it must not still be considered so easy a task as it is thought to create a beneficial establishment for a nation. It is a remarkable circumstance that the countries which have been separated from us have regretted the laws with which I governed them. This is an homage paid to their superiority, the only mode of passing a decisive sentence upon me with regard to their defects would be to show the existence of a better code in any country. New times are drawing near. It will be seen. About 5 o'clock, I was told by the Grand Marshal, who had just left the Emperor, that he wished to see me. He had stayed at home the whole of the day. I found him engaged in examining the new billiard table. He was apprehensive that the weather was too damp for walking, and he played at chess until dinner in the evening. He read us Crébillon's, Tray, and Theat. That piece seemed horrible to us. We found it disgusting, and by no means of a tragic cast. The Emperor could not finish it. The 21st, about 3 o'clock, the Emperor called for his calash. He sent for me, and we walked together to the bottom of the wood, where he had ordered the carriage to take him up. I had some particulars of no great moment to communicate, which personally concerned him. We observed in the course of our ride 2 vessels under sail for the island. At dinner, the Emperor seemed very fond of conversation. He had just been employed on his campaign of Egypt, which he had for some time neglected, and which he said would be as interesting as an episode of romance. In speaking of his position at Saint-Jean d'Acre, he observed the position which I occupied in the middle of Syria with 12,000 men only was, it must be admitted, a very enterprising measure. I was at the distance of 500 leagues from Dessay, who formed the other extremity of my army. It has been related by Sidney Smith that I lost 18,000 men before Saint-Jean d'Acre, although my army consisted of but 12,000. An obscure person, who had just gone through his exercises at college, as it seemed, who knows nothing of what he described and whose only talent is that of tacking some sentences together with a view, no doubt, of converting them to his emolument, the brother, however, of one whom I have loaded with favors and who is one of my council of state, has recently published something on that subject, on which I have cast a glance, and which vexes me on account of its silliness and the gloomy tint it endeavors to shed on the glory and exploits of that army. Had I been master of the sea, I should have been master of the East, and the thing was so practicable that it failed only through the stupidity or bad conduct of some officers of the Navy. Volney, who traveled in Egypt before the Revolution, had stated in his opinion that that country could not be occupied without 3 great wars against England, the Grand Seigneur, and the inhabitants. The latter in particular seemed difficult and terrible to him. He was altogether mistaken in that respect, for it gave us no trouble. We had even succeeded in making friends of the inhabitants in the course of a short time, and of connecting their cause with ours. A handful of Frenchmen had then been sufficient to conquer that fine country, which they ought never to have lost. We had actually accomplished prodigies in war and in politics. Our undertaking was altogether different from the Crusades. The Crusaders were innumerable and hurried on by fanaticism. My army, on the contrary, was small, and the soldiers were so little inclined to the enterprise that they were frequently tempted to carry off the colors in return. I had, however, succeeded in familiarizing them with the country, which supplied everything in abundance and at so cheap a rate that I was one time on the point of placing them on half pay for the purpose of laying by the other half for them. I had acquired such an ascendancy over them that I had it in my power by simple order of the day to convert them to the Muslim religion. They would have treated it as a joke. The population would have been gratified, and the Christians of the East themselves would have considered themselves gainers and approved of it, as they knew that we could not act better for them and for ourselves. The English were struck with consternation at seeing us in possession of Egypt. We exposed to Europe the certain means of wresting India from them. They have not yet dismissed their apprehensions, and they are in the right. If 40 or 50,000 European families ever succeed in establishing their industry, laws, and government in Egypt, India will be more effectually lost to the English by the commanding influence of circumstances than by the force of arms. In the course of the evening, the Grand Marshal put the Emperor in mind of one of his conversations with Monge, the mathematician, at Kutkier, in the midst of the desert. What do you think of all this, Citizen Monge? Said Napoleon. Why, Citizen General, answered Monge, I think if there are ever seen in this place as many equipages as at the Opera House, there must be some wonderful revolutions on the globe. The Emperor laughed very heartily at the recollection. He had, however, he observed a carriage with 6 horses on the spot. It was unquestionably the first of the kind that traveled over the desert, and accordingly, and very much surprised the Arabs. The Emperor remarked that the desert always had a peculiar influence on his feelings. He had never crossed it without being subject to a certain emotion. It seemed to him, he said, the image of immensity. It showed no boundaries. It had neither beginning nor end. It was an ocean on terra firma. His imagination was delighted with the sight, and he took pleasure in drawing our attention to the observation that Napoleon meant lion of the desert. The Emperor also told me that when he was in Syria, it was a settled opinion at Cairo that he would never be seen there again. And he noticed the thievery and impudence of a little Chinese who was one of his servants. It was, said he, a little deformed dwarf whom Josephine once took a fancy to at Paris. He was the only Chinese in France and was generally placed behind her carriage. She took him to Italy, but as he was in the constant habit of pilfering, she wished to get rid of him. With that view, I put him on board of my Egyptian expedition. Egypt was a lift to him halfway on his journey. This little monster was entrusted with the care of my cellar, and I had no sooner crossed the desert than he sold at a very low price 2,000 bottles of delicious claret. His only object was to make money, and he was convinced that I should never come back. He was not at all disconcerted at my return, but came eagerly to meet me and acquainted me, as he said, like a faithful servant, with the loss of my wine. The robbery was so glaring that he was himself compelled to confess it. I was much urged to have him hanged, but I refused because in every sense of justice I ought to have done as much to those in embroidered clothes who had knowingly bought and drank the wine. I contented myself with discharging and sending him to Suez, where he was at liberty to do what he pleased. With respect to this topic, I must observe that we were induced in this place to give momentary credit to a very singular coincidence. We were informed a few months ago that on board one of the Chinese traders, which were then off the island on their return to Europe, there was a Chinese who said he had been in the Emperor's service in Egypt. The Emperor instantly exclaimed that it was his little thief, whose story I've just told, but it was in fact a cook that had belonged to Colère. The Emperor put a sudden stop to the conversation, and with more gaiety than usual, turning to Madame Bertrand, said with a smile, "When will you be at your apartments in the Tuileries? When will you give your splendid dinners to the ambassadors? But you will be obliged, at least, I am told so, to have new furniture, for it is reported that the fashion has entirely changed in that country." The conversation then naturally turned on the magnificence and luxury which we had witnessed under the Emperor. The 22nd, the Emperor came to my apartment about 10 o'clock and took me out on a walk. We all breakfasted under the trees. The weather was delightful, and the heat, though intense, wholesome. The Emperor ordered his calash. 2 of us were with him, and the 3rd accompanied us on horseback. The Grand Marshal could not attend. The Emperor recurred to some misunderstanding which had taken place among us a few days before. He took a view of our situation and our natural wants. "You are bound," said he, "when you are one day restored to the world, to consider yourselves as brothers on my account. My memory will dictate this conduct to you. Be so then from this moment." He next described how we might be of mutual advantage to each other, the sufferings we had it in our power to alleviate. It was all at once a family and moral lesson, alike distinguished for excellent sentiment and practical rules of conduct. It ought to have been written in letters of gold. It lasted nearly an hour and a quarter, and will, I think, never be forgotten by any of us. For myself, not only the principles and the words, but the tone, the expression, the action, and above all, the entire affection with which he delivered them, will never be erased from my mind. About 5 o'clock, the Emperor entered my apartment, where I was employed with my son on the sketch of the Battle of Arcola. He had something to say to me, and I followed him to the garden, where he resumed at great length the conversation conversation that had taken place in the calash. We now dined in the old topographical cabinet adjoining that of the emperor, and the apartment formerly occupied by the Monttalon family, which, with the help of the books and shelves lately received from England, was converted into a tolerable library. As the damage done by the fire in the saloon was long in repairing, we were obliged to continue at table in our new dining room until the emperor withdrew. This circumstance, however, gave additional interest to the conversation. The emperor was very communicative today. The conversation turned on dreams, presentiments, and foresights, which the English call second sight. We employed every commonplace topic ordinarily connected with these objects, and came at last to speak of sorcerers and ghosts. The emperor concluded with observing all these quackeries, and as many others, such as those of Cagliostro, Mesmer, Gall, and Lavater, are destroyed by this sole and simple argument. All that may exist, but it does not exist. Man is fond of the marvelous. It has for him irresistible fascinations. He is ever ready to abandon that which is near at hand and run after that which is fabricated for him. He voluntarily lends himself to his own delusions. The truth is that everything about us is a wonder. There is nothing which can be properly called a phenomenon. Everything in nature is a phenomenon. My existence is a phenomenon. The wood that is put in the fireplace and warms me is a phenomenon. That candle there, which gives me light, is a phenomenon. All the first causes, my understanding, my faculties, are phenomena. They all exist, and we cannot define them. I take leave of you here, said he. And lo, I am at Paris, entering my box at the opera. I bow to the audience. I hear the acclamations. I see the performers. I listen to the music. But if I can bound over the distance from St. Helena, why should I not bound over the distance of centuries? Why should I not see the future as well as the past? Why should the one be more extraordinary, more wonderful than the other? The only reason is that it does not exist. This is the argument which will always annihilate, without the possibility of reply, all visionary wonders. All these quacks deal in very ingenious speculations. Their reasoning may be just and seductive, but their conclusions are false, because they are unsupported by facts. Mesmer and mesmerism have never recovered from the blow dealt at them by Bailly's report in the name of the Academy of Sciences. Mesmer produced effects upon a person by magnetizing him to his face, yet the same person magnetized behind, without his knowing and experience, no effect whatever. It was therefore on his part an error of the imagination, a debility of the senses. It was the act of the somnambule, who at night runs along the roof without danger because he is not afraid, but who would break his neck the next day because his senses would confound him. I once attacked the quack Puisiger on his somnambulism at one of my public audiences. He wished to assume a very lofty tone, brought him down at his proper level with only these words: if your doctrine is so instructive, let it tell us something new. Mankind will no doubt make very considerable progress in the next 200 years. Let it specify any single improvement which is to take place within that period. Let it tell me what I shall do within the following week. Let it assert the numbers of the lottery, which will be drawn tomorrow. I behaved in the same manner to Gall, and contributed very much to the discredit of his theory. Corvisart was his principal follower. He and all who resemble him had a great attachment to materialism, which was calculated to strengthen the theory and influence. But nature is not so barren. Were she so clumsy as to make herself known by external forms, we should go to work more promptly and acquire a greater degree of knowledge. Her secrets are more subtle, more delicate, more evanescent, and have hitherto escaped the most minute researches. We find a great genius in a little hunchback, and a man with a fine commanding person turns out to be a stupid fellow. A big head with a large brain is sometimes destitute of a single idea, while a small brain is found to possess a vast understanding. And observe the imbecility of Gall. He attributes to certain protuberances, propensities, and crimes which are not inherited in nature, which arise solely from society and the compact of mankind. What becomes of the protuberance denoting thievery, where there is no property to seal, and that indicating drunkenness where there are no fermented liquors, and of that characterizing ambition where there is no social establishment. The same remarks apply to that egregious charlatan Lavender with his physical and moral relations. Our credulity lies in the defect of our nature. It is inherent in us to wish for the acquisition of positive ideas when we ought, on the contrary, to be carefully on our guard against them. We scarcely look at a man's features before we undertake to ascertain his character. We should be wise enough to repel the idea and to neutralize those deceitful appearances. I was robbed by a person who had gray eyes, and from that moment I am never to look at gray eyes without the idea of fear of being robbed. It was a weapon that wounded me, and of that I am apprehensive wherever I see it. But it was the gray eyes that robbed me, reason and experience, and I have been enabled to derive great benefit from both, prove that all those external signs are so many lies, and we cannot be too strictly on our guard against them, and that the only true way of appreciating and gaining a thorough knowledge of mankind is by trying and associating with them. After all, we meet with countenances so hideous, it must be allowed. And as an instance, he described one. It was of the governor, that the most powerful understanding is confounded and condemns them in spite of itself. The 23rd, the emperor called upon me about 3 o'clock. He wished to take a walk. He had a gloomy look and had suffered much since yesterday. He was seriously affected by the intense heat during his ride in his calash. He had observed a new door which was making without, and which would have altered the whole interior of the topographical cabinet and of Madame Montholon's former apartment. He had not been consulted on the occasion, was sensibly affected at it. He sent instantly for the person who had given the directions, and the bad reasons he assigned served only to vex him still more. We were desirous of taking a walk, but it seemed decided that everything was to irritate and put him in ill humor that evening. He saw some English officers on his way and turned aside from them almost in anger, observing that shortly it would be impossible for him to put his foot out of doors. A few paces off, he was joined by the doctor, who came to tell him, unseasonably enough, of some arrangements that were making for him, the emperor, and to ask his opinion on the subject. It was one of the topics which perhaps hurt his feelings the most. He made no answer, his ordinary resource against disappointment, but this time he kept silent with a fretfulness he could not conceal. He came up with the carriage and got in, but on our way we met with some more English officers, and he suddenly ordered the coachman to drive off at a gallop in another direction. The new opening, however, which had been made in the house without his knowledge, and which he found so inconvenient, still sat heavy in his heart. He was about to lighten the load by a lively playfulness with the wife of the person who had ordered it, and who happened to be in the calash. "I sit here, you there? You are in my power. You shall pay the penalty. The husband is a guilty person. It is the wife that shall answer for him." But instead of accommodating herself to the sense in which the words were uttered, which she might have done without the least inconvenience and with the certainty of a satisfactory result, she persisted in making lame excuses for her husband and repeating reasons which served but to revive his dissatisfaction. Finally, to fill up the chapter of cross purposes, one of us, on discovering the tents of the camp, informed him that the evolutions and maneuvers of the preceding day were in celebration of one of the great victories gained by the English in Spain, and that the regiment which executed them had been very nearly destroyed in battle. "A regiment, sir, is never destroyed by the enemy. It is immortalized," was his only answer. It is true that it was delivered very dryly.